doubling down on asbestos in Vegas with this two-part episode of Asbestos Artifacts. Hey folks, we're in Las Vegas for an asbestos legal convention. Yes, they do happen. So this episode of Asbestos Artifacts is a two-parter that we're calling Viva Lasbestos. Now, Viva Lasbestos is a little hard to say, and we don't want to sound like we're making fun of asbestos illnesses, which are very serious, so we'll work on the name. But in the meantime, we've got some interesting Las Vegas artifacts to look at. Las Vegas was founded as a railroad stop between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. For decades, nearly half the people who lived there worked for the railroads, men outnumbering women 2-to-1, many on the move. So even back then, Las Vegas had saloons, casinos, and bordellos catering to folks looking to keep whatever happens in Vegas, in Vegas. Coincidentally, asbestos helped birth the steam revolution and the railroad industry, and unfortunately railroad workers, even in machine shops, are known to have higher rates of asbestos diseases. Nevada and Las Vegas are no exception. By the 1930s, the Great Depression was well on its way and the entire country was hurting financially. So in the 1930s, the Nevada legislature had an idea about using legalization to generate the economy, and at least one of their new laws increased the tourism industry. What was this new law that increased tourism? If you guessed legalize gambling, you're wrong. Nevada did, of course, legalize gambling, and it did eventually grow their economy. But at first, many of Nevada's new tourists were there to get divorced. For many years, and even in some states today, two adults cannot get divorced by law unless they give the court an authorized reason for the divorce. That means they have to list adultery or abuse or other faults that authorize the government to grant a divorce. In some cases, you even have to have a trial separation with a formal document before a divorce can be considered. Now, to many people, that sounded like government overreach, and even apart from politics, some grown adults simply didn't want to be married to each other and didn't want to wait. So Nevada realized that by legalizing divorce, many people would come there for what came to be called a quickie divorce, or what's known in the legal world today as a no-fault divorce. Sadly, for many people whose spouses simply never came home, this was their only way to get a divorce because the laws of their home state prevented them from getting divorced without the spouse present and agreeing. And that brings us to our first artifact. This is an image of Asbestos Prince and legendary divorcee Tommy Manville. Tommy Manville was the grandson and heir to the Manville Covering Company, which merged with the John Manufacturing Company of Insulation and Roofing to make the largest asbestos company in the world, responsible for a good portion of the asbestos seen in products of every kind and possibly every country around the world. Like every cliché rich kid you've ever known or seen in any TV show or movie, that was Tommy Manville. He was a misbehaving socialite, a Paris Hilton of his day. Tommy was scolded by his grandfather for showing more interest in being known as the guy who had the best time than showing interest in his family's asbestos business, despite it being a very big business indeed. And when he was a young man, Tommy's family pulled the purse strings and threatened him with disinheritance many times, eventually relenting, and ultimately Tommy received a trust fund. But the wording seems key. See, Tommy's family had wanted him to give up his bacheloring ways and settle down with a missus, maybe to even make a little Manville one day to run the asbestos business. So his trust read, guaranteed him $250,000 when he married. But to bring it all back around to Las Vegas, get ready for the sneaky lawyer trick. What the trust language didn't say was how many times Tommy could get married and collect another $250,000, a little like passing go in Monopoly. Now keep in mind, this was the mid-1930s, and $250,000 was the equivalent of Tommy collecting a check for more than $5 million. At age 17, shortly after the trust vested, Tommy was eager to get married. He met a chorus girl named Florence Huber and married her 5 days later. There are allegations that Tommy's dad paid her off and had the marriage annulled. She sued him claiming that, and later dropped the suit. It's unclear, but the marriage didn't last. Now, articles claimed that Tommy would pay the women $50,000 of his $250,000. It's the equivalent of today of about $900,000, and then he'd do it all over again. He married showgirls and actresses. He married some of them more than once. Some of them refused to take his money. Now, the key to the system was what was colloquially known as a Reno divorce. Other times he went to Mexico for a no-questions-asked divorce. Tommy was notorious for his marrying ways, appearing as the incessant playboy in tabloid newspapers and earning both a record in the Guinness Book and a Hollywood film based on his life called See My Lawyer. Long before Hugh Hefner and Playboy, Tommy Manville was the tabloid image of the old rich guy in a silk robe having photos taken of his new young girlfriend. And Tommy was famous for some pretty tasteless quotes worth repeating too. For example, "When I meet a beautiful girl, the first thing I say is, 'Will you marry me?' And the second thing is, 'How do you do?' And my favorite, 'She cried, and the judge wiped her tears with my checkbook.'" Tommy also liked cars, no surprise, and he was the first person to own a Rolls-Royce New York Roadster. Eventually, Tommy's dad died and he inherited the equivalent of $170 million. But he kept marrying women and collecting his $250,000. Here's a list of all of his wives. He was married to Florence Huber for 11 years, Lois McCoy for 5 years, Yvonne Taylor for 34 days, Marcel Edwards for 4 years, Bonita Edwards for 1 year, Wilhelma Bowes for 1 year, she refused to take his money, Macy Marie Ainsworth for only 8 hours, Georgina Campbell for 5 weeks, Britain Anita Francis Rodney Eden for 1 month, Pat Gaston for 5 months, and he was married to Christina Erdlin when he died. 11 wives, 13 marriages, and each time Tommy collected the equivalent of $4 to $5 million from his grandfather's trust. So the question is, just exactly where did all of that money come from? And that brings us to the next installment of this 2-part episode of Asbestos Artifacts. Viva Lasbestos, Part 2, Johns Manville shows its hand.